Anyone who wishes to follow me must take up his cross. They're tough words, and the apostles found out what that meant when two of the apostles were walking along with Jesus, arguing over who was going to sit at Jesus' right hand and who was going to sit at his left. Jesus said, "Can you drink the cup of sacrifice that I'm going to drink?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, "It's not my choice, but you will drink that cup of suffering and pain." And every one of the apostles was martyred with the exception of St. John, the beloved disciple, the beloved apostle. We're all called in our lives to bear our crosses. Into everyone's life, trial and tribulation comes. The question is what we do with it. Whether we like it or not, there'll be suffering. We'll get splinters from a piece of wood. We'll get headaches. We'll get trials and tribulations, people not being nice to us. Things will happen. The question is, how do we handle them? If we have some sort of trial or tribulation or cross that we have to bear in our lives, we can either make everyone else around us know about it and make them miserable as well as us miserable, or we can bear that cross and just offer it to God and say, "I don't understand how this works, Lord, but if this pain can somehow help someone else, please let me know." There's a line in the Bible that says, "We have so great a God that allows us to console others with the consolation we've received from him." Sometimes it's the fact that we suffer through things that make other people recognize that they can get through the trials and tribulations as well. Padre Pio was one of those people. He became a priest at a very young age. He was born in the late 1800s. He became a Capuchin priest. And one day he developed the stigmata, where he had wounds in his hands and in his side and in his feet. It's incredibly painful, and he hid it from the others for as long as he could. It started with just a cut in his side that wouldn't heal, and he covered it with his long brown robes. And one of the other monks saw drips of blood following after them, and they inquired about it. And he finally had to admit that he had these wounds. And people criticized him for it. Everyone thought, "Look, he thinks he's Christ." And they chastised him. Even his fellow monks and friars gave him a hard time about it. They brought doctors in to examine his wounds. They wouldn't let him practice as a priest in public for years because they thought that there was something wrong with this. And they brought medical doctors in to examine him. And they saw that when they examined the wounds, months later, they didn't get any worse and they didn't get any better. They just stayed the same. And that's not usual with a wound. With a wound, it either gets better or it gets worse. It doesn't stay the same over time. But with him, it did. And finally, they recognized that it was for real and it was from God. And the pain that he suffered, he just offered back up to God. He went through many other trials and tribulations, but it gave him gifts beyond what we can imagine. One of his greatest gifts was hearing confessions, and people would come from all over Europe, sometimes even America, just to have him hear their confession. And he had this gift of reading souls. There were times when people would come in and say, "Bless me, Father, if I have sinned. It's been 6 months since my last confession, and I lied 3 times, and I stole some paper clips from work." And he'd say, "And? Well, that's it, Father. Aren't you going to tell me about the other sin?" "Oh, yes, I was unfaithful to my wife." He knew their hearts and their souls. And he spoke the truth to them plainly. And sometimes it was words they didn't want to hear, but they had to hear it. And they were better people for it. And with the tenderest of hands, he forgave their sins on behalf of Jesus Christ. I had a teacher at St. Vincent's who was a Benedictine priest, and he was in the area of uh, Pietrelcina where he lived, and he went to have his confession heard by Padre Pio. And he came out, and it was such a wonderful experience. He felt just so light when he came out. And Padre Pio, before he left, said, "Now, don't you come back to me in less than an hour, in less than a year." Because there were thousands of people. He would hear confessions for sometimes 8 and 10 hours a day straight, taking just a little break to pray and get something to eat. 6 months later, this priest was in the same area, and he thought, "I'm going to go back and have my confession heard." He didn't get beyond, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And he heard, "I told you, don't come back in less than 6 months, and I'll get out." Out of thousands of people, he knew that that was the same priest that he told not to come back in less than a year. Padre Pio's trials and tribulations formed him into the person, the priest that he was. He knew what suffering was like, so when people came to him in the confessional, he could tell if they were suffering and knew what kind of penance to give them to bring healing to that situation, and maybe to help them to look at it differently and to change their perspective on their suffering, to see it as a gift that was purifying them, not as a scourge. There's a priest friend of mine, his name's Father Chuck, who was working on a roof on a church. He was in Clareton. There was a very poor parish. He used to be a roofer, so he put a roof on the parish house, and he was working on the roof and stepped backwards and fell off the roof and broke his back. Now he's in a wheelchair. But for several years after he got out of rehab, he continued to serve as a priest, ministering to people. And even now he's not serving as a priest in a parish, but he's doing spiritual direction. We had people in the parish who really loved him, little old people who would come to church, and I'd see them coming down the 2 steps to come out of Good Samaritan Parish, creaking and wincing as their arthritis would strike them. And I said, "How are you doing?" They said, "Oh, I got lots of aches and pains." And then they look up at me and smile, and he said, "But if Father Chuck can do it, I can do it. He's such an inspiration to me." Sometimes those crosses make us who we are, that transform us into the kind of person God wants us to be. And the way we bear those crosses sometimes makes us part of that cloud of witnesses that's in the Bible. The people that inspire us to carry on despite the trials and tribulations in our lives, offering it to God and trusting that somehow God has a plan. And whatever cross we have to bear is made to strengthen us for the road ahead. If only we can embrace it with all our hearts.